Marshal Jonah Reed smelled cinnamon before he saw the house. Not smoke, not pitch pine. Cinnamon. It made no sense at all. For 3 days the Dakota wind had been running across the prairie like a blade with no handle. It cut through wool. It cut through leather. It found the seam under your collar and pressed itself against the skin as if winter had hands. The thermometer nailed beside the livery door had cracked at 47 below. By then, numbers had stopped helping. Reed had already been to the Kepler sod house, where the door opened inward on a room so cold the water bucket had split its hoops. He had gone to the Meacham place and found 2 milk cows frozen standing in the lean-to, their heads lowered as if they were still waiting for hay. At the Whitten cabin he found Mrs. Whitten alive. Barely. Her children were wrapped around a dead stove, and her husband lay outside, in a drift 10 steps from the woodpile, one arm still reaching toward the door. So when that thread of cinnamon moved through the white air, Reed thought it was memory. A warm kitchen from before the storm, his mother's bread, a thing the cold had stolen and thrown back at him to be cruel. He pulled the frozen scarf from his mouth and breathed again. There it was, cinnamon, yeast, and beneath it a steady line of wood smoke, thin as thread, rising from a chimney almost buried by snow. The Oaks place. He stopped in the road. Of all the claims on his list, this was the one he had saved for last because he already believed he knew what waited there. Ellen Oaks and her Aunt Mara, 2 women on a raw quarter section nobody sensible had wanted. One 22 and broad through the shoulders, the other past 40, widowed, heavy-handed, quiet, with a limp that made men in town speak to her as if she were simple. They had come in late summer with a wagon, a yellow dog, a box of tools, and an old family ledger written mostly in Swedish. And instead of buying a proper cast-iron stove, they had spent the fall piling stone and clay in the middle of their room. A huge thing, a whitewashed mound with benches growing out of it, like a grave turned into furniture. People called it the Stone Cow. Some called it Mara's tomb. At the land office, Silas Crow had laughed so hard he had to wipe his spectacles. First hard freeze, he told anyone who would listen, and that ridiculous pile will be the marker over them. Reed had heard it, and in the last 3 days, after what he had seen in the valley, he had started to believe Crow might be right. But dead houses do not bake bread. He fought his way through the drift. The house was almost gone under snow. Just a low roofline, a chimney, and one black rectangle where the door had been dug clear from the inside. Reed hit the door with his shoulder. It opened. Heat touched his face. Not the sharp, dry blast of an iron stove. Not the choking heat of a fire burning too hard in a room too small. This was different. It came at him slowly, deeply, as if the walls had been storing July and were now giving it back. He stepped inside. For a moment, his eyes could not understand what they were seeing. The great stone heater stood in the center of the room, whitewashed and smooth, taller than a man's chest, and wide enough that 3 children were sleeping along one warm bench under quilts. A black iron door glowed faintly at the firebox mouth. Beside it, Ellen Oaks pulled a tray of dark rye loaves from a side oven with a long wooden paddle. Mara stood at the table, ladling bean soup into chipped bowls. On the warm floor near the heater, old Mr. Haskett sat with both boots off and his feet wrapped in linen. The Kepler boys were there. So was Mrs. Whitten, alive, her youngest child asleep in her lap. Even Reverend Pike sat on the stone bench with his Bible closed beside him, both hands pressed flat to the warm plaster like he was praying to the wall. The yellow dog opened one eye thumped his tail once, and went back to sleep. Ellen looked up at the Marshal. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and there was flour on one cheek. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired. "Close the door, Marshal," she said. "You're letting the weather in." Then Mara set another bowl on the table. "There's soup," she said, "if your hands still work. To understand that room, you have to go back to the summer. Back before the storm had a name. Back before men learned to speak more softly about the pile of stone they had laughed at. It began with a deathbed and an old ledger. Mara's mother, Ingrid, died in a rented room behind a wash house in Yankton. She had crossed an ocean as a girl, buried a husband, buried 2 sons, and kept only one thing from the old country wrapped in oilcloth inside her trunk. A ledger, not a diary. No little confessions. No pressed flowers, just measurements, firing notes, winter observations, and drawings of masonry heaters built in farmhouses that stood through Scandinavian cold. On the last night of her life, Ingrid pushed that ledger into Mara's hands. Her fingers were dry as kindling. "Do not sell the North claim," she whispered. Mara bent close. Ingrid's breath rattled. "The hill has good stone under it. Your grandmother marked it. Build where the stone remembers fire." Those were her last clear words. 3 weeks later, Mara and Ellen loaded the wagon. They kept the ledger, a broad axe, 2 shovels, 1 cracked milk cow, the yellow dog named Birch, and enough money to buy flour if they spent nothing on comfort. The North claim lay on a treeless rise above Frost Creek. The house was not really a house. It was sod-patched over cottonwood ribs, with a roof that sagged in the middle, and a chimney that had collapsed into the hearth like a broken tooth. The wind moved through it even in August. Ellen stood in the doorway, looked at the open seams, and said what both of them were thinking. "We'll be dead by January." Mara did not answer. She was kneeling beside the creek bank, scraping at a layer of pale stone with the edge of a trowel. The stone came away in flat, dense sheets. Not pretty stone, not building stone for a courthouse, but heavy, tight-grained, the kind that held the day's warmth long after sunset. Mara pressed her palm to it. Then she opened the ledger. The first drawing showed a heater shaped like a thick wall, with a short, violent firebox at one end and a maze of channels running through the mass before the smoke reached the chimney. Ellen stared at the lines. "That is not a stove." "No," Mara said. "It is a room that eats fire." That was the idea everyone missed. An iron stove throws heat fast. It gets red. It makes the air near it fierce enough to burn your hand, while the corners of the room still hold their cold. And when the fire dies, the iron gives up. It cools almost as quickly as it warmed. But a masonry heater works by patience. You make one short, hard fire, a very hot burn. The flames race through internal channels, and the stone drinks the heat before the smoke can carry it away. The fire may last 2 hours. The warmth can last 18, sometimes more. Thermal mass. That is what the modern words call it. Mara's ledger called it something better. The fire passes. The stone remembers. So they built for memory. All of September, Ellen cut sod and hauled water, while Mara sorted stone by weight and sound. Good stone rang low under a hammer. Bad stone split too easy or flaked in the hand. They dug a foundation deeper than anyone thought necessary. They set the heater on fieldstone and packed the base with sand and clay. They mixed creek mud with chopped straw until their skirts were stiff with it, and their boots gained 10 pounds. Mara followed the old drawings by lamplight. Ellen followed Mara. That was how the work moved. One reading, one lifting, both sweating, both covered in clay. both eating like hired men and sleeping like bodies dropped from a cart. They also stored food. Not a little, not enough for appearances, enough for a siege. 5 barrels of potatoes, 2 casks of beans, 160 pounds of rye flour, salt pork, onions, dried apples, turnips packed in sand, and coffee so bitter Mara said it could wake the buried. The townspeople saw the supplies and laughed harder. Because they understood a cellar, they understood sacks of flour. They did not understand why 2 women who could barely afford nails were spending their labor on a stone animal in the middle of a leaking house. Silas Crow came once in October. He wore his city coat and lifted his boots high through the mud, as if the claim itself might stain his future. "You know the improvement deadline," he said, looking past them at the unfinished heater. "If this place is found abandoned after winter, the land returns to filing." Mara wiped clay from her wrist. "It won't be abandoned." Crow smiled, not warmly. "Confidence is not proof," Ellen said. "Neither is a ledger in your office." His smile disappeared. He wrote something in his notebook before he left. Later they heard what he had written: unsuitable women, improper heating apparatus, claim unlikely to survive first severe weather. The neighbors made their visits, too. Mrs. Bell came with a basket of biscuits and a face full of pity. "My dears, I only say this with Christian concern. A cast stove is ugly, but at least it's sensible." Reverend Pike stood in the doorway one afternoon, staring at the curved bench growing from the heater wall. "Foreign ways make foreign troubles," he said. Ellen, who had been moving a stone half her size, looked at him over her shoulder. "Reverend, it is a heater." He frowned. "A man should be careful what he invites into his home." Mara did not even look up from the flue tile she was seating. "Then take care not to come inside." After that, he prayed for them in church. Not for their safety, for their judgment. But not everyone mocked. One evening, an old freight driver named Nils Arvin stopped on the road and watched the smoke test from the fence line. He had been born near Östersund, in a farmhouse where the stove was so large the children slept on top of it in winter. When he saw Mar sealing the bypass channel with a flat stone damper, his face changed. "You know what you are building?" he asked. Mara held up the ledger. "My mother knew." Nils stepped inside, removed his hat, and touched the white clay with 2 fingers. "My father's house had one," he said softly. "The fire was morning work. The warmth was all day." He came back the next week with advice, 2 iron hinges, and no pity. A traveling mason named Thomas Beck came after that. He heard the town joke about the stone cow, and rode out, because jokes about masonry often hide terrible work. He expected foolishness. Instead, he found Mara's drawing of a double return smoke path, scratched onto a board with charcoal. He squatted beside it for a long time. Then he said, "Who taught you this?" Mara pointed to the ledger. Tomas nodded once. "Then your dead are better masons than most living men." He stayed 4 days. Not as a savior, as a craftsman recognizing another craft. He showed Ellen how to seat the oven throat so smoke would not roll backward when the wind changed. He showed Mara how to slope the final channel by the width of 2 fingers. And when Ellen lifted a lintel stone he had expected to set with a jack, he stopped pretending not to stare. She noticed. "Stone won't move because you admire it," she said. "No," he answered, "but a man might." That was the first time anyone on the claim laughed. By November, the heater stood complete. White clay over stone. A firebox low on one side. A baking chamber above it. 2 benches wrapping around the central mass. a narrow sleeping platform set behind the warm wall for the coldest nights. It looked less like a stove than a promise made out of earth. The first firing nearly broke their faith. They burned dry cottonwood fast and hard, exactly as the ledger instructed. For 90 minutes, the fire roared so violently the iron door clicked and jumped in its frame. Then Mara shut the draft. The flames died. The room did not change. Ellen touched the bench, cold. She tried not to show her disappointment. Mara read the line again. Wait for the heat to arrive. 1 hour. Nothing. Another half hour. The air had turned blue with evening. Ellen reached for the bench again. This time warmth came up through her palm. Deep warmth. Not surface heat. Not the skin of heat. A slow strength inside the stone. Mara put her cheek against the plaster. Her eyes closed. When she opened them, there were tears in them. The fire passed, she said. Ellen finished the sentence from the ledger. The stone remembered. For 3 weeks the claim became almost comfortable. That was the danger. The prairie softened. The sun came out in thin, useless pieces. Men in town said the winter might not be so bad after all. That is how the worst storms enter a country. Not with warning, with embarrassment for those who prepared. On January 7, the wind shifted north. By afternoon, birds vanished from the fence wires. By dusk, the sky had no color at all. By midnight, snow struck the wall so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel. Mara woke before dawn and fired the heater. One hard burn, 90 minutes. Then she shut the draft, closed the damper, and banked the memory into the stone. Outside, the prairie disappeared. By the second day, the front window was a gray square under snowpack. The door had to be dug open from inside every few hours. The cows' shelter vanished to the roofline. They had tied ropes from the house to the woodstack, the well, and the lean-to. Even so, distance became a lie. 10 feet was enough to vanish. Ellen learned that before noon she went out to check the cow. She had one mitten looped around the rope and one arm across her face. The wind hit her so hard she turned sideways without meaning to. The house disappeared. The rope vanished into snow. The world became white noise and pain. 1 step. No house. Another step. No ground. A third step, and she fell into a drift so deep her feet did not touch bottom. She tried to shout. The wind took the sound. Inside, Mara counted. 1 minute. 2, 3. Too long. Birch the dog rose from the warm floor and began barking at the door with the kind of panic animals do not invent. Mara tied the rope around her waist and went out. The cold hit her teeth first, then her lungs, then the place in her chest where fear begins. She crawled more than walked, one hand on the rope, the other sweeping the snow. Birch kept barking from the doorway. That sound was the only thing in the world with direction. Mara found Ellen by the hem of her coat. She was 10 yards from the house. 10 yards. It might as well have been Kansas. Mara dragged her back inch by inch. Inside, she stripped the frozen wool from Ellen's arms, wrapped her in quilts, and pressed her against the warm bench. Ellen's lips were blue. Her hands shook so hard the broth spilled before it reached her mouth. For a long while, neither woman spoke. Then Ellen whispered, "I lost the house." Mara pulled the quilt tighter. "No," she said. "The house kept you." That night, someone pounded on the door. Not a knock. A human body throwing itself against wood. Mara opened it and caught Amos Bell as he fell inside, Mrs. Bell's husband. A man who had once said the stone cow would make a fine tomb. His beard was white with ice. His eyes were not proud anymore. "Stovepipe froze," he gasped. Smoke came back down. Sarah and the girls. He could not finish. He did not need to. Ellen was still shaking under quilts. Mara looked at the rope coils by the door. then at the heater, then at Amos Bell. "Can you hold a line?" He nodded. "Then hold one." Ellen tried to rise. Mara put one hand on her shoulder. "Not you." The look between them lasted 1 second. It held every argument. They did not have time to speak. Then Mara tied the longest rope around her waist, shoved the other end into Amos Bell's hands, and stepped back into the storm. The Bell house was less than 200 yards away. In weather like that, it was another country. Mara moved by fence posts when she could find them, by the shallow dip of the ground when she could not, and by a memory of the land she had learned with her boots before snow erased it. At the Bell house, smoke pushed under the eaves instead of out the chimney. Inside, Mrs. Bell sat on the floor with 2 girls inside her coat. The stove was cold, the room was colder. Mara did not argue. She did not scold. She tied the first girl to the line with a bedsheet, put the second in her arms, and made Sarah Bell hold the back of her coat. They came through the storm like one wounded animal. Once, the line went slack. Inside the Oaks house, Amos screamed into the rope as if it could hear him. Mara pulled back. The rope tightened. The storm tried to take the child from her arms. It failed. They reached the door with Mrs. Bell crawling the last 3 feet. Ellen and Amos hauled them inside. Heat closed over them. Not sudden, not dramatic, just there. Deep, steady, mercilessly alive. Sarah Bell began to cry only after she felt it. By morning, the Oaks house was no longer a house. It was the warm center of a broken map. The Kepler boys arrived at dawn, following fence wire with bare hands because their father's roof had started to cave under snow. Reverend Pike came near noon, half blind from ice. Led by Birch's barking and the smell of bread Ellen had put in the side oven because the children needed something to believe in. He stepped across the threshold and saw the Bell girls sleeping against the stone bench. He saw Mara's hands split open from rope burn. He saw the heater he had called foreign trouble holding a room full of his neighbors alive. He sat down without a word. After a long time, he put his Bible on the bench. "I mistook unfamiliar for ungodly," he said. Mara stirred the soup. "Warm your hands, Reverend." That was all the absolution she offered. It was enough. On the 3rd afternoon, Marshal Reed arrived. The cinnamon he had smelled was not a miracle. It was dried apples baked into rye dough in a side chamber, warmed by a fire that had gone out hours earlier. The warmth was not a blessing dropped from heaven because the right people had suffered enough. It was design, stone, clay. A short burn in a hot chamber. A path for smoke, long enough to spend itself before leaving. A cellar full of food, because 2 women had believed winter more than rumor. And a ledger carried across years by hands that knew survival was knowledge before it was courage. Reed stood there in the doorway, frost melting from his mustache, and understood something that made him ashamed. He had come to count the dead. Instead, he found a room full of people kept alive by the very thing the town had mocked. The storm broke on the 4th day. Not all at once. The wind tired first. Then the snow stopped moving sideways. Then morning came thin and bitter over a world remade in white. When the road opened enough for horses, Silas Crow rode out from town with a leather folder under his coat. He had prepared the abandonment notice before leaving his office. That was how certain he had been. He tied his horse to a fence post buried almost to the top rail and walked to the Oaks door. Inside, he found no abandonment. He found 9 people eating soup. He found the Bell girls fighting over the end slice of cinnamon rye. He found Reverend Pike helping Ellen stack split wood. He found Marshal Reed writing names of the living instead of names of the dead. And in the center of it all, he found Mara Oakes seated on the warm stone bench, her bandaged hands resting on her knees. Crow removed his gloves. He looked at the heater. He looked at the shelves of flour and beans. He looked at the neat repairs, the dry wood, the sleeping platform, the oven, the smoke path cleanly drawing. A claim improved. A dwelling inhabited. A system proven under the worst possible inspection. He did not apologize. Men like Crow rarely confuse correction with humility. He opened the leather folder, removed the notice, and tore it in half. Then he filled out a new certificate against the top of his saddlebag. "Final proof accepted," he said. His voice was flat, almost offended. "Title will be recorded." Mara took the paper. "Confidence is not proof," she said. Crow glanced at the heater. Then he left. The joke died slowly after that. That is how pride dies in a settlement. Not all at once. In small errands. Amos Bell came first with a wagon load of stone and asked Mara what size the foundation ought to be. Reverend Pike brought 2 boys from church to chop clay and straw. He did not preach while they worked. Mrs. Bell wrote the firing times in her own kitchen book. The Keplers built a smaller heater into the west wall of their new sod house. By the next November, 6 claims along Frost Creek had masonry heaters. By the winter after that, there were 11. The town still used iron stoves. But the outlying farms learned the difference between a fire that impresses the eye and heat that stays after flame is gone. Tomas Bex stayed too. He had meant to ride south before the thaw. Instead, he kept finding reasons to help set stone, then reasons to eat supper at the Oaks place, then reasons to stand too close to Ellen while arguing about mortar. They married in spring, under a sky finally kind enough to show blue. Birch the dog slept under the table through the whole ceremony. Mara never married again. She did not become sweet with age. She became exact. Children were warned not to waste wood in her presence. Men twice her size lowered their voices when she corrected their chimney draft. And every fall, before the first hard freeze, she opened Ingrid's ledger on the table and added the year's notes. Cottonwood burns too fast unless split small. Dakota stone holds heat longer if the inner channel is sealed with finer clay. 2 morning fires waste wood unless the wind is below 30. Cinnamon rye bakes best after the fire has been dead 3 hours. The ledger thickened. Swedish script gave way to Mara's plain English. Then Ellen's sharper hand. Then the round, careful letters of children who had grown up sleeping beside a warm wall and believing stone had always been kind. But stone is not kind. That was the lesson Mara gave them. Stone is only faithful to what is put into it. If you build badly, it remembers badly. If you hurry the channels, it returns smoke. If you starve the foundation, it cracks. If you feed it right, seal it right. Respect the path heat must travel. Then it gives back what it was given. Not forever, but longer than flame. Long enough to cross a night. Long enough to save a child. Long enough for a mocked idea to become a town's common sense. Years later, when Mara was old and her limp had become the slow clock by which the household moved, a storm came early. Not a great killer. Just a hard November wind pushing dry snow against the windows. Her great-niece found her awake after midnight, sitting beside the heater with Ingrid's ledger open on her lap. The fire had gone out before supper. The room was still warm. Mara's fingers rested on the page where her mother's final words had been copied. Build where the stone remembers fire. The girl asked whether the words were true. Mara looked at the whitewashed heater. at the bench where children had slept, at the oven mouth dark and quiet, at the wall that had outlived laughter, doubt, and one of the worst storms the prairie ever sent. Then she placed her old hand against the stone. "The fire is brief," she whispered, "but the stone remembers.